So hello and welcome to the Vilnius Jewish Public Library. It is my great honor to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Michaelas Strmiska, who will give us a lecture entitled Judaism and Paganism, Not Quite Polar Opposites. Dr. Michaelas Strmiska. Sorry, I really try to...
Just do it the way you like, it's okay.
Okay. A scholar of religious studies with a focus on mythology, modern paganism, and new religious movements. He holds a PhD from Boston University and an MA in South Asian Studies from the University of Viskonsino-Madisono. His dissertation explored afterlife beliefs in ancient India and Scandinavia. He has taught in the United States, Japan, Lithuania, and the Czech Republic, and has been awarded two Fulbright fellowships for his academic work in Iceland and Lithuania. Since 2008, he has been teaching global history and religion on SUNY-Orange, where he has also developed new courses and led education trips to Eastern Europe. In today's lecture, Strmiska will explore surprising parallels between two religious traditions not typically viewed as related, the pre-Christian so-called pagan religions of Europe and Judaism. His lecture will be held in English, but we provide translation to Lithuanian language, and I would like to thank our interpreter, Judita Gilberzaitė, for the translation. So please, Dr. Michaelas Strmiska.
Okay, well, very nice to be here. Always happy to be in Lithuania and in Vilnius. I first presented a version of this lecture about 10 years ago, once in a synagogue in New York State, once at a pagan studies conference in Krakow, Poland. In each case, when I finished, people were silent. I had the impression that maybe my Jewish audience didn't really care so much for these pagan parallels, and that my pagan friends were not so interested in connections to Judaism. But I still think it's an interesting theme, so I'm glad to speak about it tonight. And I also thought of two different ways of starting this talk. I'll give you two versions. First version is, let me reassure you, if you are Jewish, you are not expected to become a pagan because of this lecture. If you are a pagan, there's no expectation that you should become Jewish. Second version, if you are a Jew, you will definitely become pagan by the end of this lecture. If you are a pagan, you will seek to become Jewish. So, okay. So to get started, it's always good to start off defining terminology. So how about our terms Judaism and paganism? They're actually each complicated. There can be different versions of the meaning of these things. So to start with the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of Judaism, the number one definition, the one they emphasize the most, is a religion developed among the ancient Hebrews, characterized by belief in one transcendent God who has revealed himself to Abraham, Moses, and the Hebrew prophets, and by a religious life in accordance with scriptures and rabbinic traditions. Then a second definition, the cultural, social, and religious practices and beliefs of the Jews. Okay? And we even have a couple more. Conformity to Jewish rites, ceremonies, practices, the whole body of Jews, all the Jews, the Jewish people. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but you really could pick apart those four and notice that they emphasize different things about what Jews hold in common Is it religion? Is it culture? Is it practices? Is it identity? Is it history? And these are all relevant. But now let's go over to paganism. And here I quote myself. In a positive sense, when people look at paganism as a positive thing, paganism refers to pre-Christian, polytheistic, nature-worshipping religions of ancient Europe or elsewhere. And you can have this positive view if you carry the assumption that forms of religion, like polytheism and nature worship, can be seen as valid forms of religious life. But the term paganism is often used in a negative way. So then we have the other possibility. Paganism refers to pre-Christian, polytheistic, nature-centered religions of ancient Europe or elsewhere. But in the more negative view, it is assumed that polytheism and nature worship are invalid and sinful. So how we regard paganism really depends on how we evaluate these religious attitudes. Now, in talking about Judaism and paganism, the most obvious difference would seem to be that Judaism is monotheism, paganism is polytheism. But when we examine these things more closely, we see this difference is not as absolute as it may first seem. There are complexities in Jewish monotheism and pagan polytheism, and these things are worth examining to see if there could be some common ground or overlap between these two very different forms of religion. So first, let me talk about on the Jewish side. Early biblical texts refer to the Hebrews and the Israelites worshiping other deities, often really pissing off the prophets, right? So there's a lot of complaining by prophets. What's wrong with these people? Why are they doing this? So this in itself is evidence that the early, and just for simple terms, I'll just say the early Jewish people, many of them were interested in polytheism. We also know this not just from texts like the Hebrew Bible, but from archaeology. Archaeological research has found physical proof of such worship in Israel, such as statues of the deities of neighboring people like the Canaanites. And then if you think about it, the commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," we could say it kind of begs the question. What I mean is the fact that the statement has to be made rests upon the fact that there must be other gods that people know about or are worshiping. It's like having a law, against stealing. You don't have to have the law if no one is stealing, right? So here, you don't have to have a prohibition against worshiping other gods unless people are actually doing it. And then when we look into Yahweh, the main name for the Jewish God, the one God of the Hebrew Bible is neither so singular nor so solitary on closer inspection. In some texts, he is described as presiding over a council of divine beings. He is not alone. He has other divine beings, such as angels, working for him, the angels primarily in a messenger capacity. And angels, what are they? I would say they seem kind of like gods when you consider the powers they have. They are eternal. They live outside and beyond our world. They can do miraculous things. So if you like, you can say angels are not quite God or not quite gods, but they do seem to be at the very least semi-divine beings. And then when we look at biblical creation stories in Genesis or elsewhere, we see there's a lot of they and them. God's pronouns seem very flexible. In some cases, suggesting male and female forms of God, or maybe a plurality of beings. So in other words, that God is not really a singular being, but something plural. And then when we look at the different names of God, such as El, Elohim, Yahweh, and others, these different names may be interpreted simply as titles of honor, like Lord. But another way of looking at it is that they might relate to totally different beings that are being combined into one figure. And then the fact that God is jealous of other gods. Again, you don't have to be jealous if there's no rival, right? Okay. And here a brief list of various names of God. Some of them are just variations. They seem to be titles, but in some cases, we can trace them back to different cultures of the Near East and see that they might originally have referred to distinct different beings. Okay. And now let me show you some passages in the Bible that, if they're not quite polytheistic, I would say they're polytheistic-ish. They're kind of polytheistic. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness." If he's really doing this solo, it's kind of a strange way of speaking, isn't it? Okay. The morning stars sang in chorus, and all the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, shouted for joy. So here we have like a flock of gods, singing in the morning. For Yahweh, your God, is God of gods, Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God who is unbiased and takes no bribe. So again, other gods are implied, and I like this bit of commentary at the end about taking no bribe. That's how you know you have an honest God. But if Yahweh is the God who takes no bribe, why would this be mentioned unless there are other gods who do take bribes, right? Okay. Another biblical statement, all the gods bow down before him. Well, if he's really alone and the only one, there can't be others bowing to him, can there be? Okay. And again, elevated high above all gods, above the other Elohim. Who is like you among the Elohim? On all the gods, all the Elohim of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am name of God. So, I ask you, how can one be a jealous God without someone to be jealous of, right? It doesn't work. Jealousy is no fun unless there's someone to be jealous about, right? They sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods they had not known, to new gods who had recently come along, gods your ancestors had not known about. There's a whole lot there that could be unpacked. One twist of language here, of a rhetorical strategy that we find becomes very prominent in later Judaism and Christianity, is to refer to other gods as demons. In other words, their existence is still accepted, but now they're labeled as something negative. But if you were to look into the culture and religion of the Greek Hellenistic world, which included Israel for a time, the idea of demons was a really big idea. Like Socrates, you may know this, Socrates said he had his daemon, his demon, that advised him. So this idea that there are like spirits or voices or something that are all around, this was quite common in the ancient world. I also find it interesting the line complaining about gods your ancestors had not known about, which makes me ask the question, well, if our ancestors had known these gods, would it make it okay? But anyway, in a way, I'm just repeating the evidence here. There's a lot of complaining about other gods and people being involved with other gods. Okay. And then perhaps the most famous formulation of this kind of idea. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Now that really does sound very jealous, doesn't it? Because in normal human relationships, if one person becomes interested in another, it doesn't mean they hate the first one. It just means they're attracted to another. But in this case, it's either me or them. Make up your mind. If you go with them, you hate me, goodbye. Okay. And then here is an interesting phrase or passage. I am taking the kingdom from him because they have abandoned me and worship the Sidonian goddess Astarte, the Moabite god Chemosh, and the Ammonite god Milcom. So here, not only are they worshiping other gods, they're doing it in a very culturally diverse way. They're worshiping gods from different other people. So it's complicated. And this is the end of that passage. They have not followed my instructions by doing what I approve and approving my rules and regulations like Solomon's father David did. And you notice here, God is said to be complaining about these people acting like, or not acting like David. Interestingly, he doesn't include Solomon on the good list here, right? Because he could just say, why don't they do what Solomon did? No, he says, why don't they do what Solomon's father David did? Meaning David was the one who did things properly. Solomon was problematic. And Solomon, we know, had relations with women from other cultures. And there are texts that suggest he also was interested in other gods. Okay, a little bit more. And these passages here I selected because they show the idea that Yahweh governs with a council of other divine beings. It's not just him. It's like he's like chairman of the board, so to speak. And also, there are texts that suggest a hierarchy of divine beings. So it's not just humans down here and God up here. You've got humans, but then you've got other things between them, like angels and others, which begins to make a very complicated picture. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment. Micaiah said, I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne with all the heavenly hosts standing on his right and his left. So is a heavenly host polytheism, or what do you call it? It suggests many other beings are with him. Of what importance, and this is from the Psalms, of what importance is the human race that you should notice them? You made them a little less than the angels and or heavenly beings, the Elohim. So this passage is saying, humans, why are they so important? They're lesser than these other beings. Who in the skies can compare to Yahweh? Who is like Yahweh among the Elohim? Again, there's Yahweh, but there are these other divine beings, and apparently he is greater and higher, but the existence of the other beings is not denied. Okay, and just to give you a little pagan comparison here, we find in the pantheons of ancient Greece and many other pagan mythologies this idea of a group of gods who gather together to make decisions, a kind of council of gods, which actually is very similar to the Yahweh situation. So here we have, guess who that is? Yeah, Zeus. And so here we have, different images of these gathering together of Greek gods with Yahweh presiding over them. Okay. And again, another image. So here, it's actually interesting. In this kind of mythology, the functions of each god are different and separate, and they're distinguished. In the Hebrew Bible descriptions of Yahweh and others, the functions are not clear. We know the angels can be messengers. There are a few other things, like Michael can be an angel of war, things like this. But overall, they're just sort of, me and the guys kind of situation. Okay. And if you like Norse Scandinavian mythology, here's an image of Odin and all these other gods. Okay. So now let me mention the evidence from archaeology, just a little bit, and also some further things from the Bible that match the archaeology. So biblical complaints of the early Hebrew or Israelite people worshiping other deities are to some extent supported by archaeological research, because archaeologists have found images, if you like, idols, of such deities as Asherah and Baal in Israel. Okay. And here, this is a passage I cribbed from the Biblical Archaeology magazine. Author Ellen White describes this very important Canaanite goddess Asherah, who may have been combined with worship of Yahweh among the ancient Hebrew people. There's some evidence of this. So what she has to say is, who is Asherah, or perhaps what is Asherah? The Hebrew, meaning the Hebrew term Asherah, means happy or upright, and some suggest it means something like sacred place. And let me mention, I don't have it in the show here, but Asherah was often worshipped on poles. They'd have these carved poles that were these sacred images of Asherah. So the upright is quite interesting in that way. And also sacred place, because the pole would be a good way to mark out a place, right? And Ellen White goes on to say, the term that is Asherah appears 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. This goddess is known from several other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Sometimes she is known as Lady Asherah of the Sea, but could be taken as she who walks on the sea. As Atarat, or Atharat, a cognate name for Asherah, she's mother of 70 children. And White suggests this may relate to the Jewish idea of the 70 guardian angels of the nations. Arguments have been made that Asherah is a figure in Egyptian, Hittite, Philistine, and Arabic texts. Another suggestion is that Asherah is also the Hittite goddess Asertu, who's married to El-Kunursa, the storm god, who she's often associated with. Okay, so here are a couple images of Asherah that archaeologists have found. Yeah. And I just have to pause for a minute. There's such a strong tradition in Judaism, Islam, and some Christianity to take a negative view of images of God. And I have to say, at least from one point of view, it's unfortunate because often these images are very meaningful, very artistic, very beautiful. But it was part of the self-definition of the emerging Jewish tradition that we don't make images of God because God is beyond all images. And yet it's interesting that when we come to Christianity, kind of stepchild of Judaism. With some forms, images become so popular, so important, like images of the Virgin Mary or the saints among Catholics, for example. You've probably seen a few of them in Lithuania, I expect. Okay. So, big question. Did Yahweh once have a wife, or maybe just a girlfriend? So this post is carved on different sides. It has images of Yahweh, or it's believed to have images of Yahweh and of Asherah. And here again, from that same article, this four-tiered cult stand found at Tanakh is thought to represent Yahweh and Asherah, with each deity being depicted on alternating tiers or levels. Note that on tier 2, level 2, dedicated to Asherah, is the image of a living tree, often thought to be how the Asherim as a cult symbol was expressed. And when we get into trees, does this remind you of anything important in the biblical creation story? The tree of life, the tree of knowledge. Later on in the system of the Kabbalah, you also have the tree. So trees can do a lot of things in different religions, and maybe there are connections. Okay. So I've given you a lot of information about how there are aspects of Judaism where there could be said to be early polytheism, or even that the definition of God might be open to question of whether it's one God or a plurality of beings. So now let me offer you some different ways to think about this. Because, for me, as a teacher and a scholar, something that is more and more important to me as time goes on is that education and knowledge is never just presenting facts and then you're done, right? Because you can have information, but then the question is, how do you interpret it? That is just as important as the information itself. And often there can be radically different views of things. And in such cases, I think it's useful to try to take into account the different points of view. So here, let me give you what could be said to be a kind of mainstream Jewish view and then a possible pagan interpretation. So here's what I would assume to be a kind of mainstream Jewish view. Classical rabbinical Judaism. The stuff about other gods and Asherah and whoever shows an early, ignorant, polytheistic stage of the development of Judaism with stupid stuff that was eventually stamped out to make Judaism what it should be, a religion with only one God. End of story. And I would imagine if you discuss this topic with different people who are well educated in Jewish tradition, you might hear an argument like this. And now let me give you a different point of view from a more, shall we say, pagan perspective. The early Hebrew polytheism was indeed suppressed in what became classical Judaism, but this may have been a mistake. It may have been the loss of something valuable. The early variety of deities might have allowed for a broader and more diverse form of religiosity, including female forms of divinity as well as male, and thus a less patriarchal form of Judaism. Okay. So you see, how you look at it brings you to very different places. On the one hand, you can just dismiss all this stuff. It's nonsense. It was silly stuff they did a long time ago. Who cares? Or, second point of view, you could say, there might be something there. There might be something valuable in that ancient pluralism. And if you think that, what might be the next step that you would take? What might you do with that, would you say? If you think the ancient pluralism is valuable, Might you want to bring it back, revive it, recreate it, or create a new version? We'll come to that. Okay. Now, although as the classical Judaic rabbinical tradition developed, a lot of this polytheistic religiosity clearly was suppressed, if not totally eliminated. A bit later in time, we find in the Middle Ages, when the Kabbalah becomes the center of certain schools of Jewish thought and practice, again, we find a pluralism rising up. So this image here, this is the tree of life according to Kabbalah, and it has these 10 different points, these nodes, we might say, which, depending on how you interpret them, they could be seen actually as separate beings. But the general understanding is that and they're called sephirot, plural. Single would be sephirah. The sephirot are understood generally as manifestations or emanations of God. So in that respect, they're not totally separate from God, but they kind of look separate. So, and Kabbalah is a huge topic. I am no expert in Kabbalah. I just have a surface knowledge. And in Kabbalah, we find a very complex and confusing mythology and symbolic system, which seems to expand, let me rephrase that. It could be interpreted that this system expands the notion of a single supreme God, because now we have multiple divine or semi-divine beings, and they're female as well as male. Now again, they're all seen as emanations of God, but you do have a plurality here. There's just no way around that. And let me highlight, because we talked about Asherah before and the idea of feminine divinity, two female beings or principles that are of a special importance, Chokmah and the Shekinah. Chokmah is seen as one of the emanations of God in the Sephirot. So you can see right up here. Shekinah is not so directly represented, but is thought by some to be connected to this one, Malkut. Chokmah has a longer history than just Kabbalah. Chokmah goes all the way back to the Bible and is generally understood to be the embodiment of divine wisdom, sometimes with no gender, but sometimes in female form, and has sometimes been compared with Sophia, a feminine visualization of wisdom in the Greek philosophical tradition. And we know there was a lot of contact between Jews and Greeks for a certain period. Okay. So she first appears in the books of Proverbs and Job in the Hebrew Bible, as well in an apocryphal text, the Wisdom of Solomon, found in a certain Greek version of the Bible, the Septuagint. Okay. Here's a passage from the Wisdom of Solomon praising Chokmah. Okay. She is the breath of the power of God, and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. She is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God, and the image of his goodness. And being but one, she can do all things, and remaining in herself, she makes all things new. And in all ages, entering into holy souls, she makes them friends of God and prophets. And it occurs to me, if we were to take this figure and look for a parallel in Christianity, what would that be, do you think? I'll give you a hint. It's part of the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, because she enters in, she brings goodness and light. Okay. Now the Shekinah literally means dwelling, often understood as the presence of God dwelling somewhere or in someone. But the Shekinah is widely interpreted as a feminine form of God, comparable to the glorification of the Sabbath as the bride or queen of God, which we find in some texts, such as Kabbalistic texts. And so in Kabbalistic schools and in the Hasidic tradition, the Shekinah became such a prominent figure that it began to trouble some of the rabbis. And they cautioned against excessive devotion to her. Like, please, people, she's okay, she's very nice, but stop looking at her, that kind of thing. Because they were afraid that what they saw as excessive devotion to the Shekinah might be kind of pushing God out of the picture, and that too much attention was going to the Shekinah. Okay. But nowadays, the Shekinah has been of great interest to Jewish feminists seeking a female face or form of God. Oh, sorry, misspelled Shekinah there. Okay. And let me mention an interesting book, probably in this library, I would think, from 1969. A great Hungarian Jewish scholar, Raphael Patai, wrote a book, The Hebrew Goddess, where he collected a lot of traditions of feminine figures in Jewish religion. Now, let me mention that I know that at the time, he was criticized for maybe playing too loosely with these traditions and just like putting like every female or feminine thing together. But I think he made an important point that there is a feminine dimension that has often been overlooked. Because let's face it, I don't know if I would offend anyone. I think this is not controversial to say. Judaism is a very patriarchal religion, right? So whatever flaws this book may have had, it was an attempt to revive the feminine aspect. And believe me, it was not the last book to do this. This is now a strong tradition in Jewish scholarship and in feminist theology. So if you're interested, there's a lot you could look into with this. Okay. So here I just thought I'd give you a nice vision of the Shekinah. And this is just a very modern portrayal. It has no particular authority, but I thought it was a lovely image, so here we are. And here's a text by one of the Hasidic masters, Nachman of Breslev. Just as the Shekinah or divine presence is the intermediary which unites creator and creation, speech unites self and other, as well as the inner and outer aspects of each human being. Both intermediaries are luminous, radiating wisdom. In fact, the Zohar, one of the chief Kabbalistic texts, states that the Shekinah and speech are part and parcel of one another. So here he's calling attention to the Shekinah having a special role in speech and communication, and this being a very important divine power. Okay. So now I want to get back to the original theme, possible connections with paganism. And the main argument I'll make here is that once we uncover in Judaism the idea that one God could have many forms, then we're not really so far from certain forms of polytheism. as we find in paganism. So if we take the Kabbalistic structure, the Sephirot, with divine female entities seen as forms of God, I would say that there we can see a kind of middle ground between polytheism and monotheism, paganism and Judaism. So we might call this a divine loophole. It's kind of a wiggle room. And this is a very important concept in philosophy of religion and theology, one God with many forms. And this is a concept we find in many religions, including pagan religions, such as that of the ancient Greeks. When we go to the philosophers who attempted to elaborate a more sophisticated view of the pagan theology. And we also can find, if we look to India, Hinduism and Buddhism have this. So you have like the trinity of Hindu gods that are said to be just one God. You have statements in Hindu texts that the thousands of gods are in actuality just forms of one. You have goddess traditions that claim the different goddesses are just one goddess. So this is not an unusual idea. We can find it other places in the world. Yeah. And this relates to an even more immense philosophical issue, the question of the one and the many. Okay? This is a classic philosophical dilemma. I would imagine if you take a course in philosophy, or especially philosophy of religion, you'd come across this. And what's this about? Well, the problem is we live in one reality. We live on one world, right? So it's one thing. We're all part of this one thing. But it has many different aspects which can also be looked at separately. So it's one thing and it's many things at the same time. So how do we explain how that works? Especially the question of how did it all begin? How did we get to have a world like this? And then we connect it to religion. You have the problem, if it's one God creating many things, why would he, she, or it do that? And how would it work? If you're one, how can you make anything else? If you're the only thing in the world, how do other things come to exist? And if you go the other way, I'm sorry, doing it in reverse order. If you focus on the fact that there are many different elements in the world, this huge variety of many different things and beings, how could it all come from one source? That's a big issue. And then in religious terms, if you are a strict polytheist who believes the nature of reality is that there are these many different gods and goddesses who control and do different things, but where did they come from? There must be some common basis to them. So you have the many, you have the one, and to describe the relationship really is complicated. But I would say, looking at these issues here, we can find something of a common ground between some aspects of Judaism, some aspects of paganism. And now let me mention some other points of commonality. Pagan religions are often associated with nature worship and fertility gods. Right? However, Judaism also shows rich nature symbolism in the Bible and other sacred texts. The spring festival of Purim can be viewed as a kind of fertility ritual, and the festival of Sukkot is clearly a kind of harvest festival. So there seem to be things going on there that sort of move toward the pagan idea of fertility rituals. And overall, I think it could be said that Judaism takes a positive view of earthly life including physical pleasures and actually enjoying the world. Much like pagan religions, and if you've never read it and you're over 16, I would say the Song of Solomon is quite a sexy thing to read, and you might want to look at that. Okay? And it could also be used as pillow talk, I suppose. Okay. Now, another commonality, pagan religions, like such as, I'm sure some of you are acquainted with the Romuva movement in Lithuania, where they have Lithuanian Baltic gods and goddesses connected to Lithuanian and Baltic folklore. So these kind of religions often revolve around ethnic traditions and folklore that preserve ethnic identity. And for many involved, that may be just as important or more important than the religious function of contact with some god or divine power. And here, I guess it's good to interject. It's always useful to remember that people use religion for different purposes. It's not just one thing. It doesn't have just one function. People use it different ways. But the parallel, for many modern Jews, the preservation of Jewish culture and identity is a primary concern that in some cases may be more important than the actual religion itself in terms of worship or belief in divine beings or whatnot. So there you have a kind of parallel. In both cases, the religion provides a vehicle for preserving, maintaining, and enjoying old ethnic cultural traditions and keeping them alive. Okay. And I would note that some pagans see the countries associated with their traditions as sacred homelands, somewhat like how Jews would regard the Holy Land of Israel. So, I'm coming from the United States. There are people practicing Lithuanian paganism in the United States. So, what country in the world would you imagine they would see as their sacred place? Lithuania, of course. Okay. Now let me mention finally some somewhat painful parallels. In their history, both pagans and Jews have suffered persecution and oppression. The crushing of paganism across Europe, more commonly referred to as the Christian conversion of Europe, proceeded together with the growth of anti-Semitism from the time of the late Christian Roman Empire onwards. Okay? So some of the earliest anti-Semitic statements that you find in literature come from some of the early Christian leaders. So at the same time as Christians turned against the old pagan traditions, some of them also turned against Judaism, even though, as we know, Christianity is kind of the stepson of Judaism. I mean, where does the idea of a Messiah come from? What was Jesus's religion? So there is some interesting common or parallel history in terms of experiences of persecution, oppression. This may not seem so vivid to you because if you're Jewish, and actually you don't have to be Jewish for what I'm about to say, the Holocaust is such a recent, terrible experience. And of course, the recent violence in Israel also reminders of harsh persecution of Jews. So you might think, well, what do the pagans have to complain about? Well, in their case, they didn't have any single event like a Holocaust. But they had a more than 1,000-year process of constantly being pushed to become Christian. And in many cases, the paganism only survived as folklore because it had been otherwise suppressed. Okay? Another parallel, very contemporary. Today, pagans are an even smaller religious minority than Jews across Europe, in the USA, and elsewhere. The growth of the trend of Christian nationalism that we see in America and elsewhere these days, a movement that seeks a thorough Christianization of Western societies, is not good news for pagans or Jews. So it seems to me that given that both communities are minorities that could be subject to persecution depending on what happens with Western societies and other societies, an understanding of common ground and shared interests seems advisable for the future. And that's where I stop. So thank you. So happy to take questions. Yeah.
Do you think of culture contact as one of the reasons the Jews had all those other deities are coming from other cultures primarily? So it happens that as people on any boundary usually can start taking aspects from another culture.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's nothing unusual about it. When people live in any area, they automatically take in influences from those around them. So in the case of the development of Judaism, what seems to have happened is that a particular sect or branch of the larger Hebrew community developed this very strict monotheistic idea, and over time, they became the dominant group. But as we see with the things I was mentioning about the Kabbalah, Chokmah, Shekinah, etc., we can see that little traces of the earlier pluralism still lived on and are available today if people want to do something with them.
Well, this is to percolate at this
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
So again, we have to think of what winds of fashion or interest are coming through and how it affects it. Paganism, on the other hand, I mean, it's always been around in a certain way of contact with nature. I'm from Hawaii, and Polynesian cultures are extremely, they're the last Christians to be Christianized, you could say. But they mesh it all together. I mean, again, God created everything, and God is in everything, so it's very easy to shift from one to the other. And I think in Lithuania, that's what's happening. I mean, people go to church, but they also go to the folk dances around the
Well,
fires or whatever.
I knew Jonas Trinkunis, the leader of the Romuva, and I heard him several times tell a certain story, which shows he really liked the story. And the story was that, as you may know, Romuva runs a kind of folklore summer camp every year. Many people go there. And Trinkunis was really happy that a few Catholic nuns came, and they seemed to enjoy all the activities, and they had no problem of conflict between Catholicism and this pagan stuff. So it shows that it is possible to combine things and join things if you want to. Question is, what is your motivation? If you want to be separate, you can find ways to be separate. If you feel it's important to be separate, you can do that. If you want to build bridges, you can build bridges, or you can blow them up. You can do either one, so to speak.
Synchronicity seems to be, one way to...
Or syncretism.
Yeah, syncretism, to sort of braid it all together. I mean, that example of the oaks being felled when the first Christians came through. Well, it's also not a known fact that most of the wayside crosses are also now made from oaks. So it's just a way of how things move from one time to another and get readapted or reinterpreted. But the idea of identity is really probably the crucial one in both the Jewish case and the pagan.
Yeah, I would compare it to how people feel about their sports teams. People get very passionate about their sports teams. It's a big part of their identity. And if you ask them to cheer for the other team, they're going to punch you. You know, so we do get locked into our identities, but we need our identities. So it's not a simple thing.
In the globalization of all the aspects of globalization, I think, are affecting people to think a lot more about what makes them unique.
Yes, you're right. I think the globalization has two kind of contradictory effects. On the one hand, it makes available to us all kinds of stuff from other cultures. So, for like the first time I came to Lithuania about 30 years ago, there was only one Asian restaurant, an Indian restaurant, I remember. And now, you know, you can hardly get through the day without having to eat sushi somewhere, right? Because it's in Rimi, it's in Iki, it's everywhere. But I want to say that with the globalization, on the one hand, it makes available all this stuff. So if we like, we can take things in from other cultures. But it can also create the opposite impulse of feeling overwhelmed by other cultures coming into your world and then wanting to protect your culture, your identity. So I think there are two contradictory things, but I think many of us feel both of those emotions, you know, at maybe at different times in the same day. So it's interesting how that works. But let me go back to an earlier point, though. I really think it's not strange at all that religions influence each other. Let me mention that I'm much more of a scholar of the pagan religions than I am of Judaism. I only have a surface knowledge of Judaism. I don't claim much authority there. But among the pagans, a debate that comes up is it okay to take some practice or symbol from another culture? And the biggest example is actually Native American stuff. Because a lot of people love to borrow Native American things. You know, that dream catcher thing that pops up everywhere? And people love to talk about vision quests and shamanism and this and that. And the question is this being unfair to Native Americans who actually had this stuff in the first place? And I think it's not a simple matter, because history of the world shows cultures and religions are always flowing into each other. You can't really stop it, but maybe you can make some rules for how to treat people fairly if you are borrowing from their cultures. I mean, Christianity clearly took quite a lot from Judaism. It took a lot from Greek philosophy. It took a lot from Mithraism, from other religions of ancient world. How about Buddhism and Hinduism? Without Hinduism, there's no Buddhism, because Buddhism is basically reformulated Hinduism. And you could find example after example religions take from each other. How about Islam? Islam comes after Christianity and Judaism. It has elements of both. So religions are always kind of in a stream of influence and borrowing. Other questions?
Interesting about identity. In the United States, I attended the University of Chicago. Most of my colleagues were Jewish. They weren't keeping their the dietary rules, and they weren't going to the synagogue except for maybe a couple holy holidays. But even then, it was more a family ritual. So I asked them, what are you going to be passing down? Is it important to keep that identity? And it was very interesting how they explained it to me. They said, no, it's not necessarily all the rites or the beliefs or all the explanations in the Torah or whatever. it's really, and the image that they gave, I never forgot it. It's the tears and Abraham's tears that I carry in my knapsack. And that's what I have to pass on to my kids. They have to know that their forefathers, all those that came before, suffered that much, and it's for that suffering that in Egypt and Persia and Babylon, I mean, they would list the whole thing. They knew their history very well, and that's what they have to pass down as the essence.
Well, I'm sure the time you're speaking of was closer to the Holocaust, and I think you might find Jews today who maybe want to emphasize more the joyful sides. And so, being a Jew is not just about crying and being sad, but Hasidus, that's right, which is the fastest growing Jewish movement in the world. So, okay, so shall we stop there then? Time for dinner? Okay, thank you. And if anybody would like a copy of this, contact Liana, and I can send it by email if you're interested. I'll send you the PowerPoint. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. You mentioned Buddhism, and I was attending a few weeks ago. I was in one conference, and I remember it was also discussed, because many Jewish people now practicing Buddhism.
Yeah.
And
meditation,
there is a question, is it okay for Jewish people to practice Buddhism, but there are so many different forms of doing this, and people really are feeling that we are in need, to go for meditation, for this or another practice.
Well,
and yes, in today's world,
maybe another good way of framing that is to think about music. Like, say you like jazz. You may have a certain idea of what jazz is, but jazz is often borrowing from other traditions, right? So maybe you won't like this borrowing and you want to keep your certain idea of jazz, but maybe next week you'll hear some new jazz borrowing something else. Oh, I like that. And I think question is, if it borrows stuff and brings it in, does it stop being jazz or is it still jazz? And the same, with any other music or art form. And it's maybe something you can't define exactly, that something still maintains a certain stylistic identity, but maybe it can sometimes go too far and it's not that thing anymore. So
who knows? But in today's world, it's so important to feel this jazz, and to live with it, because we are really living in a global world and so much connected. So of course we want to try and see how other groups of people are living, and maybe try to, in a way we're learning about them, we sometimes practice one another.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Dr. Strmiska, and finally I can pronounce your name. By the way, from what country it comes from?
You have to guess. Yeah, Czech. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to this lecture and coming for to the Jewish Library. We're always waiting for you with all of these books where you can find a lot of interesting information. And I would like to end with an appreciation to Dr. Strmiska.
Oh, that's very nice. Well, thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, and have a great evening.